Welcome to Crimes in the Dark, the channel where the most chilling crimes come alive again in the dark. Before sleep overtakes you, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening to this story from. Now turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let yourself go, because what you're about to hear is real. Case 1. In a small South Carolina town called Cypress Hollow, where the days glided by as gently as the waters of the Cypress River, life had always been a reflection of calm and tradition. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where neighbors knew each other, and where polite conversations were the firmest norm. However, that tranquility, that protective blanket woven by generations, was shattered one cold October morning when Lynn Nakamura's lifeless body was found floating in the dark waters of the river that ran through the heart of the town. The sun was just beginning to filter through the treetops when Harold Jenkins, a veteran fisherman who knew every bend and twist of the river, noticed something strange in the water. At first he thought it was some piece of trash carried by the current, but as he drew closer, a pang of horror washed over him. What appeared to be an inert object was human-shaped. It was a body, pale and limp, trapped in the reeds as if the swamp itself were trying to hide it. With trembling hands, Harold dialed the emergency number. His usually calm voice broke as he described what he had found. The next few minutes were a mixture of contained chaos and stunned silence, as if the town itself was holding its breath at what was about to be revealed. By the time authorities arrived, the landscape had already been forever altered. The body was Lynn Nakamura's. The scene was unreal, almost surreal. The river, normally a symbol of life and connection, now seemed a silent witness to something dark and profound. At first glance, there were no obvious signs of violence in the surrounding area. There was no spilled blood, no broken objects, no traces of a struggle. Yet something about the surroundings suggested the body had been dumped there from somewhere else, as if the killer had chosen this remote corner to erase any trace of what had happened. But the crime, as is often the case, could not completely hide its secrets. Near the body, in the wet mud surrounding the river, investigators found partial shoe prints. They were deep indentations, as if someone had walked quickly or was carrying a considerable weight. Though incomplete, the prints suggested they belonged to a man. They also found a small amount of human hair that didn't match Lynn's, as well as cloth fibers clinging to a nearby branch. These clues, though subtle, began to weave a story that Ava hadn't yet revealed, but that promised to reveal uncomfortable truths. Lynn's body bore strangulation marks, reddish-purple lines around her neck that spoke of a desperate struggle. Her arms were covered in bruises, signs that she had tried to defend herself against her attacker. Her clothing was torn, as if she had struggled before losing the battle. Every detail seemed to scream that Lynn had not died peacefully, but had bravely faced her attacker, fighting until the very end. It was impossible not to feel a wave of sadness imagining her final moments, alone and terrified, in a place that should never have been her final destination. The investigation was entrusted to Detective Robert Callahan, a man hardened by years of experience in complex cases. Callahan was known for his meticulousness and his ability to read between the lines, finding patterns where others saw only chaos. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and graying hair, with a gaze that seemed capable of piercing the most elaborate lies. From the moment he arrived at the crime scene, he knew this case would be different. Not only because Lynn was a beloved figure in town, but because the murder seemed to have sprung from the very roots of the community, from the tensions and secrets everyone preferred to ignore. Callahan quickly understood that the crime hadn't been committed by a stranger. The footprints, the fabric fibers, the bruises on Lynn's body, everything pointed to someone who knew her routine well, someone who knew how to navigate Cypress Hollow without attracting attention. But there was something else too, something the detective couldn't quite define. There was a sense of urgency to the act, of unbridled passion. Whoever had done this hadn't planned every detail carefully. Rather, they seemed driven by a powerful emotion, something that drove them to make mistake after mistake. Lynn Nakamura's murder wasn't just a crime. It was a rupture in the very fabric of the community. It was an open wound that demanded answers, but it also raised difficult questions. What secrets did the residents of Cypress Hollow keep? What relationships had been strained or severed? And most of all, what kind of person would be capable of committing such a brutal act in a place where violence seemed alien? Callahan knew the answers were there, waiting to be discovered. But he also knew the road to the truth would be long and fraught with obstacles. For now, all he could do was follow the clues, one by one, until the puzzle began to take shape. Lynn Nakamura, 28, was a woman whose kindness and dedication left an indelible mark on all who knew her. Her life changed when she married Finn Nakamura, an elementary school teacher. There, she found not only a home, but also a community that quickly came to love her as much as she loved helping others. As a pediatric nurse at the local community hospital, Lynn was known for her warmth and empathy. She had a knack for connecting with sick children and their families, offering not only medical care but also comfort in the most difficult times. Her genuine smile and endless willingness to help made her a beloved figure in town. Lynn was also a devoted mother to her two young children, Amelia, 5, and Peter, 3. Her family was the center of her world, and she always found time to participate in school events, read bedtime stories, or simply enjoy quiet afternoons in the garden with them. Despite her busy schedule, she never neglected her role as a wife or her commitment to the community. She was active in charity events and helped support the local church, where her presence always brought joy and encouragement to those around her. However, beneath that facade of perfection, some rumors suggested that Lynn was facing personal problems. A neighbor mentioned seeing her argue with Finn on several recent occasions, leading to speculation about possible tensions in her marriage. Although there was no concrete evidence beyond those comments, these shadows slightly clouded the bright image of a seemingly ideal life. However, for those who knew her, Lynn remained a beacon of love and resilience, even in the most difficult times. With the first clues gathered at the crime scene, Detective Robert Callahan knew it was time to delve deeper into the lives of those around Lynn Nakamura. Every detail, no matter how small, could reveal a crucial piece of the puzzle. Contradictions, flimsy alibis, and closely guarded secrets would begin to emerge under the incisive light of his questions. It was time to sit face to face with the residents of Cypress Hollow and discover what truths lay hidden behind their friendly smiles and seemingly perfect routines. The truth was closer than it seemed. Finn Nakamura, 32, was a man who embodied the very essence of Cypress Hollow. As an elementary school teacher, his life revolved around children in his community. He was respected by his colleagues and loved by his students, who saw him not only as an educator, but also as a trusted and supportive figure. He had lived in the town his entire life, growing up among its quiet streets and natural landscapes. His marriage to Lynn Nakamura seemed like the epitome of happiness. Together, they formed a model family with their two young children, Amelia and Peter. However, beneath that perfect facade, cracks were beginning to emerge that no one had foreseen. In the weeks leading up to the crime, some neighbors noticed subtle changes in Finn. His usual friendliness seemed overshadowed by a constant shadow of worry. His colleagues commented that he had been distracted lately, as if carrying an invisible burden on his shoulders. Some had even seen him leaving school early or arriving late without explanation. These behaviors, although mild, were unusual for someone as methodical and committed as Finn. But what really caught investigators' attention was the testimony of a neighbor who claimed to have heard a loud argument between Finn and Lynn the night before the crime. According to her, the raised voices were coming from the Nakamura home, and although she couldn't make out the exact words, the tone suggested an intense fight. Finn and Lynn's marital problems weren't a well-kept secret. Investigators discovered that both had been considering divorce. This revelation added a complex layer to the case, as it raised financial and emotional motives that could have led to extreme situations. Finn had full access to Lynn's financial information, meaning he was well aware of her financial situation. If Lynn decided to separate, he would not only lose joint custody of the children, but would also face child support payments that could jeopardize his stability. For a man accustomed to planning and controlling every aspect of his life, this prospect must have been devastating. When the time came for him to be questioned, Finn presented himself before Detective Robert Callahan with a mixture of sadness and resignation. He claimed that he had been at home on the night of the crime, taking care of his children, going about his daily routine. However, this account had a weakness. Amelia and Peter, aged 5 and 3 respectively, were too young to offer reliable testimony to support his version of events. Furthermore, a close friend claimed to have seen Finn leaving his house around 9 p.m., although he could not confirm whether he had returned. This detail, although seemingly minor, raised doubts about his alibi. Had he gone out briefly to get some fresh air, as he claimed, or had he used that time to commit an unthinkable act? Finn's personality further complicated the analysis. He was a man who had always prioritized his family, sacrificing even leisure time to be present in his children's lives. His reputation in town was impeccable, and many struggled to reconcile that image with the idea that he might be involved in something as dark as murder. However, accumulated stress, marital tensions, and the potential implications of a divorce could have triggered unpredictable reactions in him. The pressure of maintaining a perfect facade while facing internal conflicts could have eroded his judgment, leading him to act irrationally. During the interrogation, Finn was cooperative, but his answers had a defensive tone that Detective Callahan didn't miss. He spoke of Lynn with a mixture of admiration and sorrow, describing her as a devoted mother and an exemplary wife. However, when asked about their recent arguments, his voice tightened, and his explanations seemed like rehearsing arguments rather than reflecting genuine emotion. It was clear he was trying to protect something, though it wasn't clear whether it was his innocence or something deeper that had yet to come to light. Marcus Reed, 45, was a man whose presence in Cypress Hollow had generated more than a few uncomfortable glances among neighbors. His return to town after being out of state didn't go unnoticed, especially since his past preceded him. Marcus had a criminal record for domestic assault related to his ex-wife, a dark chapter that many in town preferred to forget, but which remained a constant shadow over his reputation. Although he tried to keep a low profile, his intense personality and unpredictable behavior made him difficult to ignore. For some, his return seemed like an eerie coincidence, especially after Lynn Nakamura's death. The connection between Marcus and Lynn dated back to their college days, when they were both young men full of dreams and promise. Back then, their relationship had been passionate but volatile, marked by emotional ups and downs that left their mark on both of them. However, time and circumstances led them apart, and Lynn built a new life with Finn Nakamura. But fate, or perhaps obsession, brought Marcus back into her life. According to mutual friends, Marcus had tried to rekindle his relationship with Lynn after learning about the marital problems she was facing. He believed, or perhaps wanted to believe, that there was still a chance for them, a second chance to rebuild what they once had. However, Lynn flatly rejected his advances. To her, Marcus belonged to the past, and she wasn't about to open that door again. The rejection was a severe blow to Marcus, who seemed unable to accept that Lynn was no longer part of his life. Close friends noticed how his attitude changed after that. He became more withdrawn, but also more irritable, as if he were fighting an internal storm he couldn't control. A bartender at the local bar, where Marcus used to spend long hours drinking alone, mentioned hearing him mutter something about making Lynn pay for humiliating him. These words, though vague, took on a chilling meaning after the crime. Were they just phrases uttered in a moment of frustration, or did they hide something deeper and more dangerous? When it came time for him to be questioned, Marcus presented himself before Detective Robert Callahan with a mixture of indifference and barely contained hostility. He claimed that on the night of the crime, he had been at home watching television, alone, with no witnesses to back up his story. He said he lived in a remote part of town with no close neighbors who could confirm whether he had gone out. This lack of a solid alibi raised doubts among investigators, who knew that a man with his history of domestic violence could not be so easily ruled out. Furthermore, his demeanor during questioning did nothing to allay suspicions. He avoided eye contact, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and often hesitated before answering, as if carefully weighing each word. What made Marcus particularly suspicious was his evident obsession with Lynn. Although he had spent years away from her, his return to town coincided with a renewed interest in her life. According to some witnesses, Marcus had been discreetly following Lynn, observing her movements and trying to become involved in her routine. This, combined with his history of aggressive behavior, painted a troubling picture. He was a man who did not handle rejection well, someone who could be driven to act irrationally when his desires were not reciprocated. The possibility that his obsession had driven him to commit a violent act was a hypothesis investigators could not ignore. However, Marcus also had defenders in town, people who had known him for years and who claimed he had changed. They said his return to Cypress Hollow was an attempt to start over, to put his troubled past behind him and build a more stable life. For them, accusing him of murder based solely on assumptions was unfair. They argued that there was no concrete evidence directly linking him to the crime, and that his record shouldn't be enough to convict him without further evidence. Despite these voices of support, Detective Callahan knew he couldn't rule Marcus out as a suspect. His past, his recent behavior, and his lack of an alibi created a combination too suspicious to ignore. Rachel Bennett, 29, was a woman whose life seemed almost inextricably intertwined with Lynn Nakamura's. They both worked as nurses at the local community hospital, frequently sharing shifts and collaborating closely to provide care to the most vulnerable patients. Outside of work, their friendship seemed strong and genuine, spending time together at social events, coffee shops, and even family outings that included their husbands and children. To those who knew them, Rachel and Lynn were a model of camaraderie and mutual support. However, beneath that surface of harmony, rumors began to emerge that darkened their relationship and raised uncomfortable questions. During the investigation into Lynn's murder, a rumor emerged that shook the community. Lynn was said to have had an affair with Jason Bennett, Rachel's husband. This rumor, although never confirmed, was enough to sow doubt and tension among those who heard it. According to some witnesses, the rumor had circulated discreetly in the hospital, where conversations about employees' private lives were often unavoidable. Although Lynn fervently denied these accusations to those who questioned her, the damage had been done. Words once spoken have a subtle but relentless way of spreading, leaving invisible scars on those who hear them. For Rachel, the rumor must have been devastating. Imagining her best friend betraying her with her own husband would have been enough to stir deep emotions, from grief to jealousy and perhaps even a desire for revenge. Rachel's behavior in the days leading up to the crime also caught the investigators' attention. Some colleagues noticed that she seemed distant, less communicative than usual. Her easy laugh and contagious energy, characteristics that had always defined her, seemed to have slightly dimmed. In retrospect, these small signs could be interpreted as indications of stress or internal conflict. Furthermore, Rachel had access to information about Lynn's routine, as well as intimate details of her personal life. This, combined with the rumor about her alleged infidelity, meant that her name inevitably appeared on the suspect list. Was it possible that Rachel, driven by jealousy and betrayal, had decided to act irrationally? It was a question the investigators couldn't ignore. When it came time for her questioning, Rachel presented herself with a mixture of sadness and firmness. She claimed that she had been working at the hospital until late on the night of the crime. Several people confirmed having seen her there, which seemed to support her alibi. However, no one could verify every minute of her time. Night shifts at the hospital often involved quiet times, during which employees could move freely without being noticed. This time gap, though small, raised questions about whether Rachel could have left the hospital briefly to commit the crime before returning without arousing suspicion. Her version of events, though plausible, left room for speculation. What made Rachel particularly complex as a suspect was her closeness to Lynn. The two were not only co-workers, but also close friends, a relationship presumed to be built on trust and loyalty. The idea that Rachel could have acted against Lynn seemed inconceivable to many in Cypress Hollow. However, history has shown that the closest relationships can be the most fragile when faced with perceived betrayals. If Rachel believed, however mistakenly, that Lynn had crossed an unacceptable line, it's possible that her grief and sense of betrayal led her to act impulsively. Love and betrayal are powerful emotions, capable of clouding the judgment of even the most rational people. The case of Rachel Bennett was a reminder of how human emotions can be both a refuge and an abyss. On the one hand, she was a beloved and respected woman, whose connection with Lynn seemed genuine and deep. On the other, the rumor of his alleged infidelity and his lack of a verifiable alibi raised difficult questions that investigators couldn't ignore. In a town like Cypress Hollow, where the lives of its residents were so intertwined, Rachel represented the ambiguity of human nature. She was a woman who, depending on how the facts were interpreted, could be seen as innocent or a possible culprit. Her story was a mosaic of contradictions, a reflection of how pain and betrayal can transform even the strongest relationships into something fragile and vulnerable. The resolution of the Lynn Nakamura case marked a turning point in the investigation, revealing a devastating truth that confirmed the worst suspicions. The key to unmasking the culprit came when investigators delved deeper into the forensic analysis of clues found at the crime scene. Partial footprints found in the mud near Lynn's body matched Marcus Reed's boots, unusual footwear with deep grooves that facilitated his identification. Furthermore, fabric fibers clinging to a nearby branch were traced to a black leather jacket Marcus regularly wore. This evidence, though fragmentary, forged an irrefutable connection between him and the location where the body was found. During intensive interrogation, Marcus finally confessed to his crime. His voice cracking and bitter, he admitted that he had followed Lynn to the river after a heated argument about rekindling their relationship. According to his testimony, that night he was determined to confront her, convinced there was still a chance for them. However, when Lynn rejected him again, his obsession turned into blind rage. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he physically assaulted her, strangling her when she tried to resist and escape. His motive was a toxic mix of jealousy, resentment, and his inability to accept that Lynn was no longer a part of his life. Forensic analysis corroborated the details of her confession. Lynn had valiantly fought her attacker, leaving defensive marks on her hands and arms that spoke of her desperation to survive. The method used, manual strangulation, indicated an impulsive and deeply personal act, executed in a moment of extreme irrationality. After committing the crime, Marcus dumped Lynn's body in the river, believing the swamp's dark waters would forever hide her secret. The primary motive for the murder was Marcus's unhealthy obsession with winning Lynn back, fueled by years of resentment and his inability to accept her rejection. This case served as a grim reminder of how uncontrolled emotions can lead to irreparable acts, shattering lives and entire communities. For Cypress Hollow, the truth brought some closure, but it also left indelible scars on everyone who knew Lynn. Marcus Reed's trial became an event that paralyzed Cypress Hollow. During the hearings, the details of the crime further shook the town, exposing the darkness that can lurk behind the calmest appearances. The prosecution presented compelling evidence: footprints in the mud, fibers from the jacket, and forensic testimony that confirmed how desperately Lynn had fought for her life. Marcus, who initially attempted to defend himself evasively, eventually pleaded guilty, though he argued that the crime had been impulsive and not premeditated. However, for the community, this did not lessen the gravity of his actions. The verdict was clear. Marcus was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized during the sentencing that his history of domestic violence and his excessive obsession demonstrated a dangerous pattern that had culminated in irreparable tragedy. The case left an indelible mark on Cypress Hollow. Residents were forced to reflect on personal conflicts and the need to address them with peace and understanding. Lynn Nakamura, remembered for her kindness and dedication, became a symbol of resilience and community love. In her honor, a charitable fund was established to assist families in vulnerable situations, ensuring that her legacy of compassion would live on. Although her loss left a deep wound, her memory inspired significant changes in the community, reminding everyone of the importance of protecting and caring for one another. Case 2. In a small coastal town in Maine where time seemed to stand still and days were measured by the tide that rose and fell with unwavering constancy, Scarlett Collins' world came to an end in a modest apartment that reflected both her life and her obsession. The place, a studio on the third floor of an old worn brick building, was suspended between past and present, just like the stories she used to investigate. The night everything changed. The dim light of a desk lamp still shone, like a last gasp, illuminating the spot where her body had been found. Everything pointed to suicide, but beneath that first impression lurked shadows that would soon begin to move. The apartment, with its air heavy with loneliness, echoed Scarlett's life. On the kitchen table, next to an empty coffee cup and a plate with breadcrumbs that betrayed a quick and functional dinner, lay a handwritten note. The words were written in shaky handwriting, almost as if each syllable had required a superhuman effort to capture. "I can't go on like this," read the letter, signed with Scarlett's name. It was a devastating message, one that seemed to confirm what many already suspected, that the young journalist had succumbed to the invisible weight of her own mind. But it wasn't just the note that suggested this dark outcome. Her social media also told a coherent story. Weeks before her death, Scarlett had shared melancholic posts, dark images, and reflections on emotional exhaustion. Those who knew her superficially might have seen it as a warning sign, but those who truly understood her knew something wasn't right. When neighbors began speaking out, the case took an unexpected turn. Several people claimed to have heard a loud argument coming from Scarlett's apartment the night before her death. The voices they described were intense, laced with frustration and anger, though no one could distinguish specific words. This detail contradicted the narrative of a woman overwhelmed by depression and isolation. Furthermore, inside the apartment, investigators found a series of clues that cast doubt on the initial hypothesis. Detective James Hawthorne was assigned to the case, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. Hawthorne had a solid reputation within the police department. His instinct for spotting inconsistencies at crime scenes was legendary, and his meticulous patience made him the perfect candidate for solving complex cases. From the moment he walked through the door of Scarlett's apartment, he knew something wasn't right. There was a tension in the air, a sense of unease that couldn't be attributed solely to the recent tragedy. As he scanned the room, he noticed small details others might have missed. The desk lamp left on despite the clock reading well into the early hours, the careful positioning of the wine glass, the absence of any signs of a physical struggle. Each element seemed to be part of a puzzle designed to deceive. Hawthorne spent long hours in the apartment, mentally reconstructing Scarlett's last moments. He imagined the young woman sitting in front of her computer, surrounded by files and scribbled notes, immersed in her tireless search for hidden truths. Scarlett was known for her obsession with unsolved crimes, those cases that most people preferred to forget. Her work as a freelance journalist had taken her to explore dark corners of the city, turning over stones beneath which lay secrets that some preferred to keep buried. She was brave, perhaps too brave, and her dedication to exposing the truth often put her in dangerous situations. Yet she had never shown any signs of wanting to abandon her mission. This made the idea of suicide seem even more unlikely. The investigation progressed slowly, but each new discovery added layers of complexity to the case. Forensic analysis revealed that the sedatives found in the wine glass did not match any prescription drugs associated with Scarlett. This suggested that someone had deliberately introduced the substance into her system. Furthermore, the fingerprint on the window frame indicated that someone had attempted to enter or exit the apartment without using the front door. These discoveries led Hawthorne to consider the possibility that Scarlett had not been alone in her final moments. Perhaps she had received an unexpected visitor, someone whose presence had irrevocably altered the course of events. As the detective delved deeper into the case, the coastal Maine town remained wrapped in its usual tranquility, oblivious to the silently brewing storm. The moss-covered cliffs and the steady murmur of the Atlantic remained silent witnesses to the human stories unfolding around them. But this time, Scarlett Collins's story wasn't just another forgotten anecdote. It was a mystery demanding answers, a shadow that needed to be illuminated. And as Detective James Hawthorne continued searching for clues, one thing was certain. The truth was there, waiting to be discovered, hidden behind appearances and carefully orchestrated deceptions. Scarlett Collins, 28, was born in Portland, Maine, but it was in the small coastal town of Rockport where she grew up and developed her insatiable curiosity for local stories. As a child, she always showed a special interest in the mysteries surrounding her community, a fascination that deepened after the death of her father when she was just 16. He, a retired fisherman whose life was marked by simplicity and hard work, left an irreparable void in the family. Her mother, Margaret, assumed the responsibility of raising Scarlett alone, and although they shared a close relationship, the loss of the patriarch forever changed the young woman's emotional course. It was this pain that awakened in her an obsession with unsolved cases, as if seeking answers for others could fill the silence left by her father's departure. After graduating with a degree in journalism from the University of Maine, Scarlett began working as a freelance reporter but soon found her true calling: investigating unsolved local crimes. Her articles stood out for challenging official police conclusions and connecting disparate pieces of information that others overlooked. This dedication earned her both admiration and enmity, as she wasn't afraid to upset those who preferred to keep certain truths hidden. Despite her professional success, her personal life was more solitary. Her best friend, Emily Carter, described Scarlett as passionate but introspective, someone whose obsession with her work often overshadowed her personal relationships. Although she never had a steady partner, some rumors suggested she had maintained an emotional connection with George Harper, a fellow journalist. However, even those ties seemed to take a backseat to her tireless pursuit of unraveling the secrets others preferred to forget. With the first clues gathered and questions multiplying, Detective James Hawthorne knew it was time to delve deeper into Scarlett Collins' relationships. Every person close to her, every life that crossed hers, held a fragment of the truth. As the interrogations began, Hawthorne was determined to unravel the secrets everyone seemed to hide behind masks of normalcy. In this small town where everyone knew everyone else, the answers might be closer than he imagined, but also more dangerously hidden. George Harper, 34, was a man who lived in the shadows of his own ego. A journalist like Scarlett Collins, he shared the same professional field, but their methods were radically different. While Scarlett stood out for her tireless ethics and commitment to the truth, George had a reputation as an opportunist willing to take shortcuts to achieve success. Over the years, he had been accused multiple times of plagiarizing other journalists' research, manipulating data, and using questionable sources to advance his career. These practices had created tensions in his relationship with Scarlett, who had always valued integrity above all else. Despite their differences, George and Scarlett had collaborated on several occasions. Their joint projects were often fruitful, combining Scarlett's meticulousness with George's boundless ambition. Recently, however, this professional alliance began to fray. Close witnesses claimed that Scarlett had discovered something disturbing. George had falsified key information in a recent article the two were working on together. This falsification not only jeopardized Scarlett's professional credibility, but also threatened to ruin her reputation, carefully built over years. For someone like Scarlett, whose life revolved around exposing hidden truths, this betrayal must have been devastating. Furthermore, there were indications that George felt a deep envy towards Scarlett. As her fame grew and her writing gained national recognition, he seemed to fall behind, trapped in his own mediocrity. Jealousy could be a powerful poison, capable of corrupting even the most cordial relationships. George, obsessed with success, likely saw Scarlett not as a colleague, but as a rival who overshadowed his achievements at every turn. This resentment may have fueled an underlying conflict between them, one that perhaps came to a head in the days before Scarlett's death. When George was questioned by Detective James Hawthorne, he offered a seemingly solid alibi. According to his version of events, he had spent the night of the crime alone at home, watching movies on his smart TV. However, his story lacked any witnesses to back it up. Although records from his streaming service provider confirmed activity during the hours of the alleged suicide, this wasn't enough to completely prove his innocence. Watching a movie didn't guarantee that George hadn't left his house at some point to commit the crime. Furthermore, his nervousness during the interrogation caught Hawthorne's attention. It was as if he was trying to recall every detail of his alibi, mentally adjusting it as he spoke. The detective couldn't help but notice certain inconsistencies in George's attitude. For example, when asked about his relationship with Scarlett, his tone shifted subtly, oscillating between nostalgia and suppressed irritation. He seemed genuinely affected by her death, but he also showed signs of discomfort, as if he feared his past actions would be exposed. His connection with Scarlett, both professional and personal, raised too many questions without clear answers. Had he simply been a colleague frustrated by the lack of recognition? Or was there something darker at play, something George preferred to keep hidden? George's past, marked by accusations of plagiarism and unethical behavior, added another layer of suspicion. While he had never been formally convicted of these crimes, his reputation was tainted. Scarlett, known for her insistence on transparency and honesty, could have posed a direct threat to him. Perhaps he had decided to confront her. Or perhaps he had reached a breaking point where he could no longer tolerate the pressure of competing with someone as talented and committed as she was. Whatever the reason, George loomed large on the list of suspects, and his alibi, though plausible, was not foolproof. As Detective Hawthorne reviewed the evidence and testimony related to George, he began to draw connections that hadn't previously been apparent. The falsification of information in the joint article, professional jealousy, the absence of witnesses on the night of the crime, all these elements formed a disturbing mosaic. Although there wasn't yet enough evidence to directly incriminate him, George Harper remained a central figure in the investigation, a man whose secrets could reveal far more than he was willing to admit. In this case, where nothing was as it seemed, the truth still remained hidden, waiting to be unraveled. Margaret Collins, 55, was a woman whose life seemed woven with threads of silence and routine. Scarlett's mother, she lived just minutes from her daughter in the same small coastal town where they had both spent much of their lives. Margaret was known for being reserved, someone who preferred to stay away from the daily hustle and bustle. Her volunteer work at the local library reflected her quiet and methodical nature. She would spend hours organizing shelves, cataloging books and helping visitors with discreet recommendations. To those who knew her, Margaret was a kind but distant figure, someone who kept her emotions hidden beneath a facade of unwavering calm. However, those who observed her more closely could notice an undercurrent of constant worry, a shadow that seemed to follow her every move. In the weeks before Scarlett's death, this concern began to manifest itself more obviously. Margaret had repeatedly expressed concern for her daughter's mental well-being. Although Scarlett had always been independent and self-sufficient, her mother perceived signs of emotional exhaustion that others may not have noticed. Margaret tried to talk to her on several occasions, urging her to seek professional help, but Scarlett firmly rejected these suggestions. Some neighbors commented that Margaret seemed increasingly anxious and frustrated by her daughter's refusal to open up. There was something about her demeanor, a mixture of despair and exhaustion, that was striking. It was as if she carried a burden too heavy to bear alone. The forensic analysis conducted after Scarlett's death revealed a disturbing detail. The note she had allegedly written contained phrases that exactly matched comments Margaret had made about her daughter's emotional state. These words, though laden with grief, seemed more appropriate for a distraught mother than a young woman determined to end her life. This raised uncomfortable questions about the note's authenticity, and therefore about the role Margaret might have played in the events of that fateful night. Was it possible that Margaret, consumed by worry and fear, had written the note in an attempt to justify the unjustifiable? Or was she simply projecting her own fears onto a situation she could no longer control? When Margaret was questioned by Detective James Hawthorne, she offered a simple but difficult-to-verify alibi. According to her statement, she had spent the night of the crime alone at home, reading a book. There were no witnesses who could confirm her story, as she lived in a quiet residential area with no security cameras or close neighbors who could have seen her entering or leaving. Her story, although plausible, lacked any conclusive evidence. Furthermore, her demeanor during the interrogation raised some doubts in the detective. Margaret displayed a mixture of genuine sadness and barely concealed discomfort, as if she were struggling to recall every detail of her alibi. This underlying tension made her account sound less convincing than she probably intended. The relationship between Margaret and Scarlett was complex, marked by a deep emotional connection, but also by inevitable differences. Since the death of Scarlett's father, Margaret had become the pillar of the family. She had sacrificed much of her own life to raise her daughter, working long hours and forgoing many of her personal aspirations. Although Scarlett had always been close to her mother, her obsession with unsolved crimes and her solitary lifestyle often created a rift between them. Margaret, pragmatic and traditional, didn't always understand the intensity with which Scarlett pursued her investigations. This led to moments of friction, where mutual love failed to dispel irreconcilable differences. What struck Detective Hawthorne most, however, was the possibility that Margaret had acted from a place of extreme love. If she truly believed Scarlett was on the verge of emotional collapse, might she have taken drastic measures to save her? This kind of twisted reasoning was not uncommon in cases involving people deeply affected by despair. The human mind, when faced with absolute pain, can justify actions that under other circumstances would seem unthinkable. Margaret, who had dedicated her life to protecting her daughter, may have reached a breaking point where she saw no other way out. As the detective continued to investigate, Margaret remained at the center of his thoughts. Her alibi, though weak, wasn't enough to directly incriminate her. However, her emotional connection to Scarlett, combined with the suspicious details of the suicide note, made her role in the case impossible to ignore. In this small coastal town, where secrets were often buried along with the past, the truth was still hidden, waiting to be discovered. And as the Atlantic continued to murmur against the cliffs, the weight of uncertainty seemed to envelop everyone involved, including Margaret Collins. Thomas Reed, 40, was a man whose ambition seemed boundless. The owner of a website dedicated to sensational news, he had built his media empire on a mix of eye-catching headlines and content designed to generate clicks at all costs. His approach was far from ethical. Thomas prioritized immediate impact and profit over truth or journalistic integrity. Under his leadership, the site became a go-to for those seeking scandalous or controversial stories, even if many of them lacked rigorous verification. It was a world where facts mattered less than public attention, and Thomas knew this better than anyone. Scarlett Collins had been hired by Thomas months earlier to write exclusive articles. Her talent for investigating unsolved crimes and her ability to connect disparate pieces of information were exactly what he needed to raise the profile of his platform. However, their relationship soon began to deteriorate. Thomas's work demands were excessive, even abusive. Scarlett, who had always valued professional ethics, found herself trapped in a system that contradicted her deepest principles. Thomas's constant pressure and manipulative tactics led Scarlett to make a drastic decision: resign. But what could have simply been the end of a professional collaboration turned into something much more dangerous when Scarlett threatened to reveal fraudulent practices carried out by Thomas. The young journalist had discovered that Thomas's website used fake anonymous sources to fabricate sensational stories, generating massive traffic and increasing advertising revenue. These practices were not only unethical, but also potentially illegal. If Scarlett decided to go public with these accusations, Thomas's business could crumble in a matter of days. The site's reputation would be ruined, and with it, everything Thomas had built over the years. For a man like him, whose identity was intrinsically tied to his professional success, this prospect must have been unbearable. Scarlett didn't just represent a dissatisfied former employee, she was a direct threat to his livelihood. When Thomas was questioned by Detective James Hawthorne, he offered a seemingly solid alibi. According to his account, he had been at a conference in Boston on the night of the crime. Several people present at the event confirmed having seen him there, which seemed to support his innocence. However, upon reviewing the details, the detective noticed troubling inconsistencies. Although Thomas had attended the conference, the exact times of his stay did not entirely match the estimated time of Scarlett's death. There was a window of time during which his whereabouts could not be verified with certainty. This gap in his alibi raised uncomfortable questions. Had he used that interval to commit the crime and then return to the conference without arousing suspicion? It was a possibility that could not be ruled out. Thomas's behavior during the interrogation also didn't go unnoticed. Although he tried to maintain a calm and cooperative demeanor, there were times when his nervousness subtly seeped through. He avoided looking directly at the detective when discussing his relationship with Scarlett, and his tone of voice changed slightly when mentioning the accusations she had made against him. It was as if he were measuring every word, adjusting his account to avoid revealing too much. These kinds of reactions, however subtle, were enough to pique the curiosity of a seasoned investigator like Hawthorne. Thomas had clear motives for wanting to silence Scarlett, and his alibi, though plausible, wasn't foolproof. Furthermore, the detective couldn't ignore how Thomas's personality fit the profile of someone capable of going to extreme measures to protect his interests. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, no matter what means he had to use. His career was built on deception and manipulation, and it wasn't hard to imagine that he might have crossed an even darker line if he felt his business and reputation were in danger. Scarlett, with her tireless determination to expose the truth, likely represented everything Thomas feared: transparency, fairness, and consequences. In his mind, eliminating her might have seemed like the only way to secure his future. Yet as the case progressed, Detective Hawthorne knew that appearances could be deceiving. Although Thomas had motives and a flawed alibi, there was no conclusive evidence directly linking him to the crime. The mystery remained shrouded in shadows, and each clue seemed to lead to more questions than answers. In this small coastal town where the Atlantic waves constantly crashed against the cliffs, the truth still lay hidden, waiting to be unraveled. And meanwhile, Thomas Reed remained a central figure in the investigation, a man whose secrets might hold the key to solving the Scarlett Collins case. The resolution of the Scarlett Collins case came after weeks of exhaustive investigation that tested the patience and ingenuity of Detective James Hawthorne. Ultimately, all clues pointed to Thomas Reed, Scarlett's former employer, whose unethical methods and fraudulent practices had been threatened by the young journalist. During intense interrogation, Thomas confessed to hiring a hitman to eliminate her, a desperate act motivated by fear of losing his business and reputation if Scarlett's accusations became public. The murder was carefully planned to look like a suicide. According to Thomas's confession, the hitman acted precisely around 10:30 p.m., taking advantage of an illegal copy of Scarlett's apartment keys. The hitman sneaked in while she was alone, quickly immobilizing her to prevent any resistance. They then administered sedatives in a wine glass strategically placed on the nightstand, as if Scarlett had chosen to take them voluntarily. As the sedative began to take effect, They drafted a fake note mimicking the victim's handwriting using previously emailed documents. This note, written in manipulated phrases and laced with desperation, was intended to convince the world that Scarlett had decided to end her life. However, not everything went according to plan. Although the crime was meticulously planned, small, inevitable mistakes eventually exposed the truth. A partial fingerprint found on the window frame suggested someone had tried to enter or leave without using the front door. Even more crucial was the carpet fiber found under Scarlett's fingernails, which perfectly matched the carpet in Thomas's car. This tiny but powerful detail proved Thomas had been directly involved in the crime. Furthermore, forensic analysis revealed that the signature on the note supposedly written by Scarlett did not correspond to her usual handwriting, but rather an imitation based on previous emails Thomas had intercepted. The motive behind the murder was clear. Scarlett had discovered that Thomas's website was using fake anonymous sources to fabricate sensational stories, generating massive traffic and increasing his advertising revenue. These fraudulent practices were not only unethical but also potentially illegal. If Scarlett decided to go public, Thomas's business would crumble, taking his reputation and livelihood with it. For him, eliminating her was the only way to protect himself. Despite hiring a hitman and orchestrating an elaborate plan to cover up the crime, imperfect details led to the collapse of his strategy. The carpet fiber, the discrepancy in his handwriting, and the inconsistency in his alibi during interrogation were enough to shatter his facade of innocence. Ultimately, Thomas admitted his guilt, revealing how his obsession with success and fear of failure had driven him across an irreversible line. His confession not only closed the Scarlett Collins case, but also exposed the darkness that can lurk behind unbridled ambition. Thomas Reed's trial was closely followed by the Rockport community and the national media, given Scarlett Collins' reputation as a journalist dedicated to exposing uncomfortable truths. During the proceedings, the evidence presented by the prosecution, including carpet fibers from Thomas's car, forensic analysis of the forged note, and his partial confession during cross-examination, built a compelling case. Although Thomas attempted to argue that he was pressured by a fear of failure and that he had not acted directly, his role as an instigator of the crime was irrefutably proven. The final verdict found him guilty of premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit a felony. The judge sentenced him to 30 years in prison without the possibility of early parole, highlighting the calculated cruelty of the crime and the devastating impact on Scarlett's family. Furthermore, Thomas's website was ordered to be shut down immediately, and its assets were frozen to cover civil claims filed by those harmed by his fraudulent practices. Scarlett's death left an indelible mark on those who knew her and on the journalistic community, where she became a symbol of integrity in the face of media manipulation. Her legacy inspired the creation of a fund to support young journalists committed to ethical investigations. Meanwhile, Thomas faced not only the loss of his freedom but also the complete collapse of his media empire, marking the end of an era dominated by irresponsible sensationalism. Case 3. In the quiet and picturesque city of Savannah, Georgia, where time seems to stand still among the majestic centuries-old oak trees draped in Spanish moss and the cobblestone streets that whisper stories of the past, an atmosphere of almost eternal serenity reigned. It was a place where the days passed slowly, wrapped in gentle breezes and golden hues at sunset. But this peaceful, everyday life was brutally interrupted by an event that left everyone shaken: the death of Eleanor Vance, an emblematic figure in the city's cultural life. Eleanor was much more than a renowned artist. She was a creative force who challenged convention and captured attention with her unique and provocative style. At 52, she had established herself as one of the most influential voices in contemporary art. Her studio, located in a restored old mansion in the heart of the city, was a sanctuary of controlled chaos. The walls were covered with vibrant paintings that seemed to come to life with every brushstroke, while haunting sculptures rose in every corner, as if holding unspeakable secrets. For those who knew Eleanor, this space reflected not only her talent, but also her complex and deeply introspective soul. One gray autumn morning, when fog still enveloped the streets and the air smelled of damp leaves and fresh earth, Savannah's world changed forever. Eleanor's lifeless body was found in her studio, lying on the wooden floor, surrounded by indescribable chaos. A single gunshot to the heart had ended her existence, but what shocked those who arrived most was the scene surrounding her. Easels had been overturned, their canvases ripped as if trying to silence them forever. Shards of pottery scattered across the floor glittered in the dim light filtering through the worn curtains. The room, once a haven of creativity, now resembled a battlefield where something dark and unfathomable had occurred. The local police were quickly alerted, and leading the investigation was Detective Gabriel Monroe, an experienced man whose reputation had been forged on the most difficult cases to solve. Gabriel was known for his meticulousness and his ability to read between the lines, finding patterns where others saw only chaos. Middle-aged, with thinning gray hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much, Gabriel had an imposing presence, but also an innate sensitivity that made him stand out among his colleagues. He knew this case wouldn't be easy. From the moment he crossed the threshold of Eleanor's study, he knew he was facing something deeper and more complicated than a simple crime of passion. Here appearances were deceiving, and secrets lurked behind every brushstroke, every shadow cast on the walls. The studio, though devastated, remained a place charged with meaning. On the walls, remnants of paintings depicted surreal and symbolic images, filled with darkness and melancholy. One series in particular, titled Shadows of the Soul, caught Gabriel's attention. These works were especially disturbing, even for someone accustomed to dealing with the worst of human nature. They were abstract portraits of distorted human figures, shrouded in shadows that seemed to move depending on the angle from which they were viewed. Some of the canvases were incomplete, as if Eleanor had been working on them until the very last moment. What had she wanted to express with these pieces? Were they a reflection of her own internal struggle or something more? Gabriel knew the answers might be hidden in those strokes. As the investigation progressed, details of the murder began to emerge. The shot that ended Eleanor's life had been precise, almost surgical, suggesting that whoever pulled the trigger knew what they were doing. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, indicating that the victim likely knew her assailant. However, the mess in the room raised additional questions. Had it been intentional to cover up the crime, or was it the result of an emotional outburst? Among the pottery shards and paint remnants, a small, barely perceptible blonde hair was found caught in one of the torn canvases. This detail would go unnoticed by many, but not by Gabriel, who ordered it to be analyzed immediately. The murder weapon, a commonly made pistol, was found a few feet from the body, partially covered by a blood-stained cloth. At first glance, it appeared to have been left there deliberately, as if the killer wanted to implicate someone else or simply create confusion. However, Gabriel noticed something peculiar. The fingerprints had been carefully cleaned, but small traces of gunpowder remained clinging to the handle. This suggested that whoever had used it was not a seasoned professional, but someone acting under pressure, perhaps driven by anger or fear. As Gabriel walked through the studio, absorbing every detail, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of admiration and sadness for Eleanor. Her work was powerful, visceral, capable of evoking intense emotions in anyone who viewed it. But it was also evident that her life had been marked by a series of contradictions and tensions that he might never fully understand. Every brushstroke seemed to tell a story, and now the detective had the task of deciphering which of those stories had led to her tragic end. The Eleanor Vance case was not only a professional challenge for Gabriel Monroe, but also a reminder that, even in the quietest and seemingly safest places, evil could infiltrate in unexpected ways. As the Savannah community tried to process the loss of one of its most beloved figures, Gabriel knew his work was just beginning. And somewhere, in the shadows of that studio, the truth waited. Eleanor Vance, a 52-year-old visual artist, was an enigmatic figure whose life was a mixture of public admiration and dark rumors. Childless and divorced from Thomas Vance, a retired businessman with whom she had a relationship marked by tension and disagreements for years, Eleanor lived in creative solitude. She had no siblings or living parents, which left her isolated in a world that seemed to revolve exclusively around her art. Her surrealist style, laden with dark symbolism, had made her an iconic figure in the cultural sphere, but also fueled speculation about her emotional and mental state. Although the public admired her for her ability to capture deep emotions in her works, her personal life was fraught with contradictions. Rumors of addiction and turbulent relationships always followed her, weaving an image of fragility beneath her apparent strength. Her almost fanatical obsession with her art was well known. She would spend entire days locked in her studio, immersed in a creative process that seemed to consume her completely. Recently, she had begun work on a series titled Shadows of the Soul, a collection that even her most devoted followers considered too dark. The pieces explored themes such as loss, melancholy, and the inevitability of death, perhaps reflecting an even more intimate and vulnerable side of Eleanor. Behind every brushstroke, an internal battle seemed to lurk. His canvases were not only works of art, but also windows into his tormented soul, a soul that perhaps never found peace. With the first clues gathered in Eleanor's study, Detective Gabriel Monroe knew it was time to delve deeper into the victim's personal relationships. Each suspect kept secrets, and his task was to unravel them. In an austere interrogation room where time seemed to stand still, Monroe prepared to confront the possible suspects. With calculated calm and a penetrating gaze, he began to weave his web of questions, searching for inconsistencies and hidden truths behind each answer. The truth was close at hand. He just had to listen carefully. Thomas Vance, a 58-year-old man, was a well-known figure in Savannah, not only for his successful career as a real estate developer, but also for his complicated relationship with Eleanor Vance, his ex-wife. Their marriage, which had lasted more than 2 decades, ended in a bitter divorce 5 years ago, leaving open wounds that never fully healed. Although the two tried to maintain a semblance of civility at first, tensions between them became evident as time passed. Financial and personal disputes began to dominate their interactions, turning what was once a marriage full of promise into a constant battle. Thomas owned a successful real estate company and, thanks to an unusual legal agreement following their divorce, retained certain rights to the property where Eleanor had her studio. This arrangement, although designed to avoid major conflicts, became a source of additional friction. Thomas occasionally visited, claiming he needed to monitor the property, but Eleanor always perceived these visits as an invasion of her creative space. For her, the studio wasn't just a place to work, it was her refuge, a sanctuary where she could freely express her deepest emotions through her art. Thomas's presence there always carried a sense of intrusion, something she wasn't willing to tolerate. In the months leading up to the murder, tensions between the two reached new heights. Thomas had initiated legal proceedings to claim a share of Eleanor's profits from her recent sales, arguing that their shared ownership played a crucial role in his artistic success. Eleanor, for her part, steadfastly refused to give in to this demand, considering it unfair and baseless. According to sources close to the family, arguments between the two had escalated in recent weeks, turning into verbal sparring matches filled with resentment and frustration. Some witnesses claim to have heard Thomas threaten her during a public party weeks before the crime. Although no one could confirm exactly what words were exchanged, Thomas's aggressive tone caught the attention of those present, leaving a disturbing impression that would remain in their minds. When news of Eleanor's murder reached Thomas, he was visibly shaken, although many interpreted his reaction as a calculated act. During interrogation, Thomas claimed to have been in Atlanta the night of the crime, attending an important business meeting. However, his alibi proved to be weak and fraught with inconsistencies. He was unable to provide reliable witnesses to corroborate his version of events, which increased suspicions surrounding him. Investigators noted that his demeanor alternated between indignation at being considered a suspect and moments of nervousness that seemed genuine. It was as if Thomas knew that every word he uttered was being carefully analyzed, searching for any clue that might unmask him. As the investigation progressed, additional details emerged that further complicated Thomas's position. It was discovered that he had made several visits to Eleanor's studio in the days leading up to the crime, ostensibly to review documents related to the property. However, some neighbors reported seeing him lurking in the area even after these official visits, raising questions about his true intentions. Furthermore, evidence was found that Thomas had been pressuring Eleanor not only for money, but also to sell the property and end her artistic career. For him, the studio was a valuable investment that could yield large profits if he managed to seize full control. But for Eleanor, it represented much more. It was her legacy, her identity, her reason for being. Thomas's domineering and controlling nature contrasted sharply with Eleanor's introspective and sensitive nature. While she lived to create, he lived to accumulate wealth and power. This fundamental difference was one of the main reasons their marriage failed, but it also set the tone for their subsequent relationship. Thomas never truly understood or valued Eleanor's art, seeing it more as a tool for profit than an authentic expression of her soul. This lack of mutual understanding fueled the resentment they both felt, turning every encounter into an inevitable confrontation. Despite the suspicion surrounding him, Thomas insisted on his innocence, claiming that his dispute with Eleanor, though heated, had never escalated to physical violence. Investigators knew, however, that human emotions were complex, and that hatred and resentment could manifest in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, Savannah residents watched warily, wondering if the man who had once been Eleanor's husband might have crossed that invisible line between anger and crime. Ava Hazel, a 34-year-old young woman, was much more than a simple assistant in Eleanor Vance's life. Since being hired 3 years earlier, Ava had quickly established herself as the renowned artist's right-hand woman, playing a crucial role in both her creative work and the day-to-day running of the studio. However, behind this seemingly solid professional relationship lay a complex and often tense dynamic. Ava didn't just see Eleanor as a mentor. She also deeply admired her, although that admiration was intertwined with a growing frustration. For Ava, working alongside such an iconic figure as Eleanor was both a blessing and a burden. On the one hand, she constantly learned from her talent and experience. On the other, she felt her own artistic ambitions were being overshadowed by her boss's imposing shadow. As an emerging artist, Ava had aspirations of her own that went beyond simply being someone else's assistant. For years, she had secretly worked on her own projects, dreaming of the day when her name would shine as brightly as Eleanor's. However, that hope seemed increasingly distant as long as she remained under her mentor's wing. Privately, Ava expressed her frustration to close friends, confessing that she felt professionally jealous of Eleanor. It wasn't just envy. It was the feeling that Eleanor was using her as free labor, taking advantage of her dedication without giving her the recognition or opportunities she believed she deserved. This mix of resentment and admiration created a relationship fraught with contradictions, where Ava struggled between her gratitude toward Eleanor and her desire to become artistically independent. The investigation revealed even more compromising details about Ava. It was discovered that she had been selling some of Eleanor's works without her knowledge or permission, using the proceeds to fund her own personal projects. This act not only demonstrated an alarming level of disloyalty, but also raised questions about her true intentions. Was it simply a desperate attempt to advance her career? Or was there something darker behind her actions? Investigators began to suspect that Ava might have been planning to permanently distance herself from Eleanor, perhaps even eliminating her as an obstacle to her own success. When it came time for her questioning by Detective Gabriel Monroe, Ava tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear she was nervous. She assured Detective Gabriel Monroe that she had been home watching a movie the night of the crime, claiming she had spent the entire evening alone. However, this alibi soon faltered when her neighbor reported seeing her rush out shortly after 9 p.m., right around the estimated time of the murder. The neighbor's testimony added a new layer of suspicion to the case. According to him, Ava appeared agitated, was wearing a dark jacket, and was walking hurriedly, as if trying to avoid being seen. This detail, though small, proved to be key for investigators, who began to seriously question her version of events. Ava's demeanor during the interrogation didn't help dispel the doubts either. Although she answered questions calmly at first, her tone gradually changed as she noticed how Detective Monroe connected the dots between her statement and the evidence collected. When asked why she had been selling Eleanor's works without her consent, Ava fumbled, coming up with excuses that sounded unconvincing even to herself. She tried to justify herself by saying she was doing it out of financial necessity, and that she never intended to hurt Eleanor, but her words lacked sincerity. Each answer seemed to open new cracks in her story, suggesting she was hiding something important. What struck Monroe most was the duality in Ava's personality. On the one hand, she projected an image of innocence and devotion to Eleanor, speaking of her with both respect and nostalgia. But on the other hand, her actions told a different story. The clandestine sale of the works, her suspicious night out, and her growing frustration with Eleanor painted the profile of someone who may have been driven by intense emotions. Ava may not have planned the crime from the outset, but the detective knew that crimes of passion often emerged in moments of anger or desperation. Perhaps, in a fit of rage, she had crossed a line she never imagined crossing. Marcus Reed, a 45-year-old man with an imposing reputation in the art world, was known as much for his refined taste as for his volatile and unpredictable nature. As a collector, Marcus didn't just seek out masterpieces. He yearned to own unique pieces that captured the very essence of creative genius. His obsession with acquiring the unattainable had led him to build an impressive collection, but it had also made him a controversial figure within artistic circles. Among the works he most coveted were those by Eleanor Vance, whose surrealist style, laden with dark symbolism, had captivated his attention for years. Marcus had purchased several of Eleanor's pieces in the past, but his interest intensified when she began working on her new series titled Shadows of the Soul. This collection, still incomplete, awakened in him an almost feverish ambition. The relationship between Marcus and Eleanor had always been complicated, marked by a mixture of admiration and tension. While Marcus viewed her works as treasures to be acquired at any cost, Eleanor considered them extensions of her soul, fragments of her identity that could not be bought or sold without reflection. When Marcus offered her an exorbitant sum for the entire Soul Shadows series, he expected her to accept without hesitation. However, to his frustration, Eleanor flatly refused, arguing that the collection was not yet complete, and that she had no intention of parting with it at that time. This rejection unleashed a storm of emotions in Marcus, who was unused to hearing the word no. Someone like him, accustomed to obtaining what he wanted through money or influence, found the idea of something escaping his control intolerable. The investigation revealed emails recovered from Eleanor's device that showed a much more aggressive side to Marcus. In them, he accused Eleanor of playing him, of manipulating him to increase the value of his works with false promises. His messages, though carefully worded at first, soon turned hostile, filled with accusations and veiled threats. It was clear that Marcus felt Eleanor was looking down on him, and this perception fueled a dangerous mix of anger and resentment. Although he never explicitly expressed violent intent, the tone of his words suggested that his patience was reaching its limit. For someone like Marcus, accustomed to domination and control, Eleanor's refusal must have been an unbearable humiliation. When Detective Gabriel Monroe questioned Marcus about his whereabouts on the night of the crime, he claimed to be attending an art auction in Charleston. Several people confirmed having seen him there, which seemed to corroborate his initial alibi. However, a closer look at the schedules exposed a significant gap. Marcus had arrived late to the auction and could not prove exactly what he had done between 8 and 10 p.m., the estimated time frame in which the murder occurred. This inconsistency raised suspicions among investigators, who began to wonder whether Marcus had taken advantage of that window to commit the crime before appearing publicly at the auction and establishing a seemingly solid alibi. Marcus's demeanor during the interrogation was calculated, but not entirely convincing. Although he answered questions with forced calm, his responses sometimes sounded rehearsed, as if he had anticipated each question and prepared a carefully structured reply. When confronted with the aggressive emails he had sent to Eleanor, he attempted to downplay their significance, arguing that they were simple business arguments that had escalated due to misunderstandings. However, the defensive tone of his voice and his evasive gaze suggested that there was more to his nonchalant facade. Monroe noticed how Marcus struggled to maintain control, repeatedly adjusting his tie and crossing and uncrossing his legs, small gestures that betrayed his nervousness. What intrigued the detective most was Marcus's almost unhealthy obsession with possessing Eleanor's works. For someone like him, accustomed to buying and accumulating art as a symbol of power and prestige, Eleanor's refusal must have been a devastating blow. How far could he have taken his obsession? Was it possible that, in a fit of rage, he had decided to remove the obstacle standing between him and the pieces he so desired? Although there was no conclusive evidence directly linking Marcus to the crime, his erratic behavior and inability to explain his whereabouts during key hours placed him in an awkward position within the investigation. Emily Carter, a 29-year-old young woman, had long been Eleanor Vance's sole heir. As the niece of the renowned artist, Emily always held a special place in her aunt's life, although their encounters were sporadic and marked by generational differences. Emily worked as a graphic designer in Atlanta, a career that, although creative, didn't share the same level of prestige or introspective depth that characterized Eleanor's art. Despite this, the relationship between the two seemed solid, at least until a few months ago. Everything changed when Eleanor decided to draft a new will, excluding Emily from her inheritance. This act not only severed the remaining familial ties, but also unleashed a storm of resentment and conflict between them. Eleanor's decision to disinherit Emily was a devastating blow to the young woman. According to sources close to her, Emily was furious, feeling betrayed by the person she had once considered her greatest supporter. Speculation about the reasons behind this drastic measure pointed to irreconcilable differences over how to handle Eleanor's artistic legacy. For Emily, her aunt's work was a potential source of financial stability and recognition. She wanted to ensure the works were strategically marketed and preserved. However, Eleanor, always protective of her art, saw these ideas as a threat to her creative vision and the integrity of her work. These differences led to tense and emotionally charged confrontations, with Emily accusing her aunt of being selfish and inflexible, while Eleanor defended her right to decide the future of her legacy. The investigation into Eleanor's murder soon revealed disturbing details about Emily's behavior in the days leading up to the crime. Close witnesses confirmed that arguments between aunt and niece had escalated to disturbing levels. Emily made no secret of her anger, and according to some accounts, had even threatened to take legal action to contest the new will. Her frustration was palpable, and many in her social circle noted how this conflict consumed her. For Emily, being excluded from the inheritance not only meant losing access to Eleanor's works, but also feeling rejected by someone she had always admired and respected. This mix of emotions, anger, resentment, and grief, placed her in a vulnerable position within the investigation. Under questioning by Detective Gabriel Monroe, Emily tried to maintain a calm appearance, but her nervousness was evident. She claimed to be in Atlanta working from home the night of the crime, arguing that she had spent the entire evening focused on work projects. However, phone records told a different story. The data showed that her cell phone had been active in the Savannah area around the estimated time of the murder, contradicting her initial statement. This discovery added a new layer of suspicion to the case, suggesting that Emily may have been much closer to Eleanor's studio than she admitted. Detective Monroe noticed how Emily struggled to maintain her composure in the face of this incriminating evidence. When confronted with the phone records, her tone changed from defensive to evasive. She tried to justify herself by saying that she might have accidentally activated her phone while driving to Atlanta, but this explanation sounded unconvincing. Furthermore, her failure to provide witnesses to corroborate her whereabouts during those key hours increased doubts about her version of events. Each answer she offered seemed to open new cracks in her story, suggesting that she was hiding something important. What struck the detective most was the intensity of the emotions surrounding Emily. Her relationship with Eleanor had gone from a loving connection to a minefield of tension and resentment. For Emily, being disinherited not only meant losing a potential fortune, it also represented a profound emotional rupture. It was possible that, in a moment of anger or despair, she had acted out of grief and a sense of injustice. Although there was no conclusive evidence proving her direct involvement in the crime, her presence in Savannah during the time of the murder and her obvious conflict with Eleanor established her as a central figure in the investigation. Detective Gabriel Monroe, known for his meticulousness and ability to connect the subtlest dots, finally gathered all the key evidence that would unravel the mystery of Eleanor Vance's murder. During an exhaustive search of the studio, a small but crucial detail caught his attention. A barely perceptible blonde hair caught in a torn canvas near Eleanor's body. This seemingly insignificant find turned out to be the central piece of the puzzle. Forensic analysis revealed that the hair belonged to Ava Hazel, Eleanor's young assistant and artistic pupil. With this evidence in hand, Monroe began to piece together the events of that fateful night. The investigation also uncovered something even more incriminating. Ava had used a pistol registered to Thomas Vance, Eleanor's ex-husband. The gun had been obtained illegally weeks before the crime, presumably during a visit to the studio when Thomas wasn't present. This connection between Ava and the murder weapon was the catalyst that led the detective to confront her with the accumulated evidence. Under the pressure of the irrefutable facts, Ava finally confessed, although her account was as disturbing as it was revealing. According to her testimony, Ava had planned to steal one of the works from the Shadows of the Soul series, obsessed with selling it to fund her own artistic projects. She believed Eleanor was using her solely as free labor, failing to recognize her talent or provide her with the opportunities she deserved. That night, at approximately 9:15 p.m., she entered the studio using a key Eleanor had previously given her. Confused by the darkness and nervous, she began searching for one of the most valuable pieces in the collection. However, her plan fell apart when Eleanor unexpectedly returned to the studio. Caught in the act, Ava tried to justify her presence, but the situation quickly escalated into a heated argument. Eleanor, furious upon realizing Ava's intentions, confronted her with harsh words and threatened to denounce her publicly. At that moment, tensions reached their peak. According to Ava, in a moment of absolute panic, she pulled out the gun she had stolen weeks earlier, thinking she could use it to intimidate Eleanor and escape undetected. However, the situation spiraled out of control. An accidental struggle ended in a detonation that killed Eleanor. Dazed and remorseful, Ava attempted to cover up the crime by defacing the study to make it look like a botched robbery, hoping the authorities would interpret the murder as an act driven by the greed of an unknown intruder. During the interrogation, investigators noticed gunpowder residue on Ava's hands, irrefutable proof that she had fired the gun. Although she had carefully cleaned the gun to remove fingerprints, this technical detail went unnoticed, sealing her fate. Her confession coincided with other evidence collected, including her suspicious nighttime outing reported by her neighbor, and her inability to explain her exact whereabouts during key hours. The murder occurred in an emotional context charged with jealousy, frustrated ambitions, and pent-up resentments. For Ava, Eleanor represented both a source of inspiration and an insurmountable obstacle in her artistic career. Her motivation wasn't just economic, it was personal. She wanted to prove that she could shine on her own, free from the imposing shadow of her mentor. However, her decision to take on one of Eleanor's works as a quick fix for her problems proved to be a fatal mistake that destroyed 2 lives, Eleanor's and eventually Ava's. The Soul Shadows series, which so obsessed Eleanor, was never completed. However, after her death, these works achieved posthumous fame, cementing her place in art history. For many, the mystery of her death added another layer of intrigue to her already fascinating legacy. Her darkened paintings, full of symbolism and melancholy, were now seen not only as expressions of her creative genius, but also as reflections of the tensions and contradictions that defined her life. And as the case drew to a close, it became clear that Eleanor's art transcended even tragedy, leaving an indelible mark on those who viewed it. Ava Hazel's trial captured the attention of Savannah and the art world. Presented as a young woman whose ambition led her to commit an irreversible act, Ava faced multiple charges, including involuntary manslaughter and aggravated robbery. During the trial, her defense argued that the shooting was accidental, the result of a moment of panic and not premeditated. However, the prosecution emphasized the planning behind the robbery and the overwhelming evidence, such as the hair on the canvas and gunpowder residue, arguing that Ava had acted out of greed and professional jealousy. Ultimately, the jury found Ava guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. The sentence marked a turning point for everyone involved. Thomas Vance, although cleared of any direct involvement, decided to sell the studio property, unable to bear the memories. Eleanor's works, especially the Shadows of the Soul series, fetched record prices at auction, cementing her legacy as her story became a tragic symbol of human passion and conflict. For Ava, prison provided a forced opportunity to reflect on her actions. Although her artistic career was cut short, some speculated that, within her confinement, she would find a new, perhaps more authentic form of expression, far from the shadows she always sought to overcome. Case 4. In the quiet town of Blackthorn, Vermont, where days passed by whispering in the wind through the pines and nights were lit only by the faint glow of the stars, something dark burst forth to disrupt the apparent calm. On the night of October 15th, an unusual storm lashed the town with unexpected fury. Thunder echoed like wild heartbeats, and the rain fell in thick sheets that seemed to conceal what was about to be revealed. In a Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, a brutal crime took the breath away from those who had once believed Blackthorn to be a safe haven. Inside that ancient house, whose walls held secrets from decades past, 2 women were found murdered in the main living room. Their bodies lay in positions that suggested desperation and violence. One of them was lying near the fireplace, her hands extended toward the fire that was no longer burning, as if she had tried to reach something before falling. The other victim lay next to the sofa, her face partially covered by a silk blanket embroidered with floral motifs. It was evident that someone had tried to hide them, but the attempt was hasty and ineffective. The fatal wounds caused by a knife spoke of a cold and intentional cruelty. A kitchen knife, likely the instrument of the crime, had disappeared from the mansion, leaving only traces of blood that marked the path to horror. Darkness enveloped the scene when neighbors alerted the police after hearing muffled screams that seemed to be coming from the mansion. Upon arrival, officers discovered not only the bodies, but also disturbing details that echoed a much more complex tragedy. On the living room table, a handwritten letter with blurred letters seemed to be the testimony of someone who hadn't had time to finish their message. In a doorframe, a lock of dark hair remained trapped as if a clue left by fate. And on the floor, next to the fireplace, a broken pocket watch read 9:47, plunging everything into darkness. The investigation fell into the hands of Detective Eleanor Grayson, a middle-aged woman whose reputation had been forged on cases as intricate as this one. With her brown hair always tied back in a practical ponytail and a penetrating gaze that seemed able to read between the lines, Eleanor was known for her meticulousness and her ability to unravel the most tangled threads. Her arrival in Blackthorn was greeted with a mixture of hope and fear. The townspeople knew she would stop at nothing to uncover the truth, but they also feared what that truth might reveal about themselves. From the first moment, Eleanor felt that the mansion itself seemed to breathe. Its long hallways, decorated with portraits of people no one remembered, seemed to watch her every step. The air inside the house was thick, charged with an energy that couldn't be explained in words. As she examined the place, she noticed small details that others might have missed. The broken pocket watch, for example, had an initial engraved on it, M. The handwritten letter, though largely illegible, contained a phrase that could still be made out, "Trust no one." And the lock of dark hair caught in the doorframe seemed to belong to someone who had been there that night, someone who perhaps hadn't expected to leave any trace. The double murder at the Victorian mansion not only shook Blackthorn, but also exposed the hidden cracks beneath the surface of that seemingly idyllic community. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a secret. Every object found at the crime scene told a different story. Eleanor knew that solving this case wouldn't be easy. There was something about the atmosphere of the mansion, something about the way the victims had been arranged, that suggested this wasn't an impulsive act, but something carefully planned. As the investigation progressed, Eleanor began to piece together the events of that fateful night. The storm had been the perfect backdrop for such a brutal crime. The thunder would have drowned out any suspicious sounds, while the darkness provided ideal cover for whoever had committed the act. The lights being out were no coincidence. Someone had deliberately cut the electricity, ensuring the mansion was plunged into darkness. And the use of a kitchen knife, an everyday and easy-to-find object, indicated that the killer knew the house and its surroundings well. What intrigued Eleanor most was the silk blanket. Why partially cover the victims? Was it a gesture of remorse or simply an attempt to buy time before the crime was discovered? Every question led to another, and every answer seemed to open up new unknowns. But Eleanor was determined to move forward, aware that behind this tragedy lay a web of secrets she must unravel. Meanwhile, the town of Blackthorn remained silent, watching from afar as the detective worked. They knew the truth would soon come out, and they feared that when it did, nothing would ever be the same. Eloan Hartley, a 34-year-old woman whose life revolved around words and the shadows they cast, was a writer of Gothic novels who had captured the imagination of many. Single and childless, she dedicated much of her life to weaving dark and melancholic stories, set in small rural towns that seemed plucked from her own memories. Her pen had a hypnotic quality, capable of transporting readers to worlds where mystery and horror intertwined with the everyday. Although her talent earned her a degree of fame, it also attracted complications. Recently, she had been facing financial problems due to a copyright lawsuit, a conflict that had plunged her into deep anxiety and threatened to overshadow her career. Her only close family was her younger sister, Serafina Hartley, who lived in Boston. Their relationship was close, though marked by physical and emotional distance. Eloan had always been reserved, even somewhat eccentric, preferring the solitude of her Victorian mansion in Blackthorn to the bustle of the city. However, those who managed to get close to her discovered a kind and generous person, with a mind as brilliant as it was complex. She loved to spend hours in front of the fireplace, surrounded by old books and flickering candles, indulging in ideas that she later captured on paper. Serafina Hartley, a 29-year-old whose life was illuminated by the light captured through her camera, was a freelance photographer specializing in artistic portraits. With an almost palpable sensitivity, she had a gift for capturing the essence of her subjects in each image, revealing emotions that often remained hidden. Although her professional career flourished in Boston, where she lived, her personal life was marked by a complicated relationship with her mother, who lived in another state. This physical distance reflected an emotional chasm that Serafina was never able to fully bridge, and although she tried to maintain a strong appearance, the weight of that tense relationship was always present. Her deepest bond was with her older sister, Eloan Hartley. Despite the age difference and the very different paths they had taken, they both found solace in each other's company. Serafina occasionally visited Eloan at Blackthorn, where the two would retreat to long nightly conversations in front of the fireplace. Those hours of connection were like a balm for both of them, a space where they could be completely honest without fear of judgment from the outside world. However, in recent months, Serafina had begun to notice a troubling change in Eloan. Her sister, always reserved and eccentric, seemed to be sinking deeper into dark thoughts and paranoid behavior. Though this unease grew within her, Serafina never mentioned it publicly. She kept her worries to herself, perhaps because she feared that speaking them would make the very thing she so desperately wanted to avoid a reality. In those moments by the fire, watching Eloan lose herself in her own thoughts, Serafina felt a lump in her chest, a mixture of love and fear she didn't know how to unravel. With the first clues gathered at the crime scene, Detective Eleanor Grayson decided it was time to delve deeper into the stories of those who knew the victims. Each suspect held fragments of the truth, and her mission was to unravel them. Through interrogations, she would look for inconsistencies, hidden emotions, or overlooked details that might reveal the culprit. The key to solving the case lay in the words, but also in what they revealed. So, Eleanor prepared to confront the possible perpetrators, one by one. Atticus Greaves, a 42-year-old man whose life was marked by a mixture of charm and shadows, lived next door to the Victorian mansion where the tragic crime occurred. For years, he had been a close friend of Eloan Hartley, sharing long conversations with her about literature, history, and the mysteries they both seemed to enjoy exploring. Atticus had an imposing yet gentle presence, with brown hair flecked with premature gray and eyes that seemed to hold unfathomable secrets. His deep voice and storytelling ability had made him a respected figure on local historical excursions, where he worked as a tour guide after abandoning his academic career. However, Atticus's past wasn't as idyllic as it appeared. Before moving to Blackthorn, he had been a university professor, a position he lost due to accusations of inappropriate behavior toward students. Although he was never formally prosecuted, the rumors ruined his reputation and forced him to seek a new life away from the spotlight. In Blackthorn, he found refuge in the tranquility of the town and in the friendship of Eloan, who accepted him despite knowing fragments of his difficult history. But their relationship wasn't just one of camaraderie. There was something deeper, something many whispered about. There were rumors that Atticus and Eloan were having a secret romantic relationship, though it was never publicly confirmed. These rumors, however, sowed seeds of jealousy and resentment among those who knew them both. What made Atticus even more suspicious was his precarious financial situation. He had accumulated a significant debt with Eloan after she lent him money to avoid losing his house. The loan, although offered with good intentions, created a complicated dynamic between them. Atticus always promised to repay the money, but difficult circumstances seemed to constantly delay that commitment. Some in town speculated that this debt might have created tensions between them, especially if Eloan had begun to pressure him to recover at least some of what he owed her. When investigators questioned Atticus about his whereabouts on the night of the crime, he claimed to be at a book club at the Blackthorn Public Library between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. However, when they attempted to verify his alibi, no one could directly confirm his presence. The organizers of the club admitted that several people had arrived late or left early due to the storm, leaving a gap in Atticus's timeline. This detail, coupled with his close relationship with Eloan, his financial troubles, and rumored romantic connection, cast him in an awkward light in the investigation. Despite his calm appearance, Atticus seemed to carry an invisible burden. During interrogation, his answers were measured and calculated, as if he knew exactly what to say to avoid arousing suspicion. However, there were times when his gaze would wander, as if he were seeking a mental outlet rather than a physical one. His demeanor raised doubts in those who observed him. Was he simply a nervous man trying to prove his innocence, or someone who knew more than he was willing to admit? Questions about his true relationship with Eloan, his outstanding debt, and his whereabouts on the night of the crime continued to hang in the air, with no clear answers. Atticus's surroundings also added layers of complexity to the case. His small house, located just minutes from the Victorian mansion, was filled with old books and artifacts related to local history, reflecting his passion for the past. But there were also signs of clutter, unopened letters, piling up bills, and scribbled notes with dates and names that didn't match any known public events. These small clues suggested that Atticus lived in a world of his own, one where the boundaries between reality and fantasy sometimes seemed blurred. Marlowe Finch, a 38-year-old woman whose ambition seemed boundless, was known in literary circles as a ruthless and calculating editor. Her reputation was built on a mix of commercial astuteness and an almost unhealthy obsession with professional success. With an elegant yet intimidating demeanor, Marlowe projected an image of absolute control, always impeccably dressed and with a smile that rarely reached her eyes. She was the type of person who didn't hesitate to crush anyone who stood in her way to the top, and her career was marred by controversial decisions that left a trail of resentment. As Eloan Hartley's editor, Marlowe had been instrumental in the writer's rise to literary fame. However, their professional relationship had become strained in recent months. Weeks before the crime, the two had argued publicly about the terms of Eloan's publishing contract. The writer had expressed dissatisfaction with the restrictive clauses that limited her creative freedom and threatened to change editors if a more equitable solution wasn't found. For Marlowe, this prospect represented not only a significant financial loss, but also a blow to her pride and influence in the industry. Determined not to lose such a valuable author, she began looking for ways to ensure that the rights to Eloan's future works remained under her control, even if it meant resorting to unethical tactics. But the conflict with Eloan wasn't Marlowe's only cause for concern. She also feared that Serafina Hartley, the writer's younger sister, would reveal compromising information about fraudulent practices within her company. Serafina, a photographer with access to sensitive documents due to her occasional collaboration with the publisher, had begun asking uncomfortable questions about certain irregular financial transactions. Marlowe knew that if this information fell into the wrong hands, it could destroy not only her career, but also her personal life. This constant fear kept her in a permanent state of alert, analyzing the Hartley sisters' every move with a mixture of paranoia and determination. When investigators called Marlowe in for questioning, she presented herself with her usual unwavering confidence. She claimed that on the night of the crime she had been registered at a hotel in Montpellier, 2 hours away from Blackthorn. As confirmed by the hotel's receptionists, she had indeed signed in and out on those dates. However, the lack of security cameras in the hotel lobby left a significant gap in her alibi. Marlowe claimed she had spent most of the night in her room reviewing contracts and strategizing ways to resolve the conflict with Eloan, but she was unable to provide any witnesses to corroborate her version of events. Detective Eleanor Grayson noticed something peculiar about Marlowe's demeanor during the interrogation. Although he appeared calm, his gestures were overly calculated, as if he were rehearsing every move to avoid mistakes. His answers were precise and direct, but there were times when his gaze wandered, as if he were mentally assessing the consequences of each word he spoke. When questioned about his relationship with the victims, Marlowe adopted a professional tone, describing his relationship with Eloan as purely businesslike and downplaying any hint of personal conflict. However, his body betrayed a tension that contradicted his facade of indifference. What intrigued Eleanor most was Marlowe's duality. On the one hand, she was a successful woman who had built a publishing empire from scratch, earning the respect and fear of many in the industry. On the other hand, she was someone capable of making ruthless decisions when she felt her position was in jeopardy. Her obsession with control and her ability to manipulate situations made it difficult to discern where her ambition ended and her cruelty began. Furthermore, her interest in the rights to Eleanor's future works and her fear that Serafina would expose her fraudulent practices added layers of motivation that could not be ignored. Silas Thorne, a 50-year-old man whose life seemed to have been shaped by loneliness and resentment, was known in Blackthorn as a quiet and somewhat mysterious figure. With his untidy gray hair and his clothes perpetually covered in dirt, Silas worked as a gardener, tending the grounds of mansions and old houses belonging to the local elite. To many, he was little more than a shadow in the background, someone who went unnoticed as he tended to the plants and shrubbery. However, behind that inconspicuous appearance, Silas harbored a complicated history marked by a criminal record related to breaking and entering. Although he had never been charged with a serious crime, His past made him someone the townspeople instinctively distrusted. Silas's relationship with Elowen Hartley wasn't exceptionally close, but it was fraught with underlying tensions. Elowen had hired him to maintain the grounds of her Victorian mansion, a job that initially seemed like just another routine assignment for Silas. Over time, however, a sense of resentment toward her began to develop. According to some rumors in town, Silas considered Elowen a booty woman, someone who represented everything he despised about the local elite. Her quiet arrogance, her indifference to those below her on the social ladder, and her ignoring of the struggles of those living on the margins. This resentment grew even more intense when Elowen abruptly fired him after a dispute over payment for his work. According to Silas, she hadn't delivered on their agreement, leaving him with less money than he'd expected. For him, this wasn't just a financial issue, but a personal offense that further fueled his animosity toward her. In addition to this conflict, there were persistent suspicions that Silas had a disturbing tendency. He was said to steal valuable items from the homes where he worked. Some neighbors had reported unexplained petty thefts after Silas performed work on their properties. Although there was never conclusive evidence directly linking him to these incidents, the speculation was enough to keep him under constant surveillance by those who hired him. In the case of Elowen's mansion, his regular access to the grounds and occasionally to the interior of the house made him a potential suspect if valuables were found missing. These rumors, combined with his resentment toward Elowen, placed him in an awkward position in the double murder investigation. When Detective Eleanor Grayson questioned Silas, she immediately noticed his evasive attitude and obvious discomfort with questions. Silas claimed that he had been in his cabin on the night of the crime, repairing gardening tools. He described how he had spent hours cleaning rusty blades and adjusting broken handles, trying to justify his whereabouts with technical details. However, when asked to provide witnesses to confirm his story, Silas could offer none. He lived alone, isolated in a small cabin in the woods, and no one could corroborate that he had actually been there during those critical hours. His lack of a solid alibi, coupled with his history and strained relationship with Elowen, made him appear a plausible suspect. What struck Eleanor most was the way Silas seemed to avoid eye contact during the interrogation. His answers were brief and calculated, as if each word weighed heavily and he had to choose it carefully before speaking. There were times when his voice trembled slightly, revealing a vulnerability that contrasted with his gruff, disheveled appearance. When questioned about his relationship with Elowen, Silas adopted a defensive tone, insisting that her parting had been unfair and that he had no reason to harm her. However, his body betrayed a tension that contradicted his words. His hands, stained with dirt and calloused from years of manual labor, moved nervously on the table, as if searching for something to hold. Silas's living environment also added a layer of mystery to his profile. His cabin, located at the edge of the woods, was a dark and cluttered place, filled with old tools, dusty books, and objects that appeared to have been collected from various locations. Some of these objects bore markings or inscriptions suggesting they might have come from homes where he had previously worked. Although there was no definitive evidence that they were stolen, their presence raised further questions about his behavior and work ethic. Furthermore, the cabin was surrounded by an air of neglect, as if reflecting Silas's emotional isolation and distrust of the outside world. As Eleanor sorted through the pieces of the puzzle, it became clear that Silas Thorne was much more than a simple gardener. He was a man marked by resentment, loneliness, and a series of decisions that had alienated him from society. His criminal record, his complicated relationship with Elowen, and his lack of a solid alibi made him a key suspect in the investigation. However, it was also evident that there was something deeply human about him, a mix of frustration and pain that might have led him to make mistakes but didn't necessarily point to him as a murderer. The truth, as always, remained hidden, waiting to be discovered in the shadows of his solitary life. The key to solving the case came when investigators focused their attention on the letter found on the living room table. Although the words were blurred and partially illegible, forensic analysis revealed it contained a threat directed at Elowen. The wording suggested an impending confrontation, likely related to copyright and the writer's future career. This discovery led investigators to focus on Marlowe Finch, whose conflicts with Elowen were well known and documented. During an exhaustive interrogation, Marlowe finally succumbed to the pressure and confessed to his involvement in the crime. He explained that he had gone to the mansion that night intending to confront Elowen about the rights to her future works. He feared losing not only a valuable source of income, but also control over an author whose career he had helped build. However, what began as a heated argument quickly escalated when Serafina, hearing the screams, intervened to defend her sister. According to Marlowe, it was at this point that he lost control. In a fit of rage, he grabbed a knife from the kitchen and attacked both women, brutally ending their lives. After the crime, he attempted to cover the bodies with a blanket, possibly to make it appear that the murder had been the work of an intruder. However, his attempt to conceal the crime proved hasty and incomplete. During his escape, he dropped a lock of dark hair in the doorframe, a piece of evidence that later matched DNA samples collected from Marlowe. This detail, along with the threatening letter and the context of his dispute with Alowan, definitively sealed his guilt. The weapon used, a kitchen knife missing from the mansion, was never recovered, but investigators confirmed it was a common household item, indicating planning on Marlowe's part. His pocket watch, always present with his usual attire, was also left behind at the scene, a mistake that further exposed his involvement. With these elements, the events could be accurately reconstructed, bringing the case to a close and exposing the dark truth behind the tragedy at the Victorian mansion. Marlowe Finch's trial was one of the most high-profile in Blackthorn's history, attracting the attention of both the local community and national media. During the proceedings, the evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming. The lock of hair that matched his DNA, the threatening letter addressed to Alowan, and the forensic testimony that accurately reconstructed the crime. Marlowe remained stoic throughout much of the trial, although at times she became visibly shaken when the details of Serafina's murder, whose intervention had triggered the tragedy, were discussed. Ultimately, the jury found Marlowe guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, underscoring the premeditated and cruel nature of the double crime. The decision was met with a deathly silence in the courtroom, broken only by the stifled sobs of some in attendance. The consequences of the case resonated deeply in Blackthorn. The Hartley family was devastated, but Alowan's literary legacy was honored with a series of posthumous publications that raised funds to support young artists. Meanwhile, Marlowe Finch's reputation was ruined, and his publishing company collapsed after being linked to fraudulent practices. For the townspeople, the case served as a grim reminder of how unbridled ambitions can lead to moral and human collapse. The Victorian mansion, now considered a tragic site, was sold and converted into a museum dedicated to the memory of the victims. Case 5. On a quiet October afternoon, as the golden leaves gently fell onto the pavement and the crisp air heralded the arrival of autumn, Pinecrest Ridge, a small California town known more for its bucolic landscapes than for newsworthy events, became the scene of a crime that shook the entire community. It was there, in the parking lot of the Pinecrest Community Center, that the fate of Amber Sutherland, a trenchant and passionate 34-year-old journalist, abruptly came to an end. Her death not only left an indelible mark on those who knew her, but also exposed the shadows lurking beneath the idyllic facade of this town. Amber had been sent to Pinecrest Ridge to cover what seemed like a routine assignment, interviewing Mayor Kenyon Bagshaw and other local leaders as part of her campaign trail coverage. The Pinecrest Community Center, a modest but welcoming building with wide windows and high ceilings, had been chosen as the ideal location for the event. However, what began as a promising afternoon ended in tragedy. Minutes after Amber left the center and headed for her vehicle, gunshots rang out in the air, shattering the stillness of the afternoon. No one could have imagined then that those sounds would mark the beginning of an investigation that would shake the community to its foundations. Amber's body was found face down next to her dark blue sedan, a vehicle that reflected her practical and discreet style. The multiple gunshot wounds to her back and head spoke of a swift and brutal attack, executed without mercy. Beside her, as if silent witnesses to the crime, lay objects that suggested her journalistic work had been violently interrupted. A digital recorder damaged by a bullet impact, and a notebook stained with her blood. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, indicating that Amber may not even have had time to defend herself. Everything indicated that the killer had surprised her, taking advantage of her vulnerability in that solitary moment. Nearby security cameras captured blurry but revealing images. A hooded figure prowling the area minutes before the murder. Dressed in dark clothing, this person seemed to move stealthily, as if he knew exactly what he was doing and when. The crime scene also offered clues that sparked both interest and concern among investigators. A .38 caliber bullet casing was found next to the vehicle, a key piece that could link the killer to the weapon used. On the hood of the sedan, barely visible partial fingerprints suggested someone had been close enough to leave unnoticed traces. A torn business card belonging to Mayor Kenyon Bagshaw was also found, a detail that fueled questions about possible connections between the crime and the event Amber was covering. Finally, black fiber remains on the asphalt, possibly from a jacket or sweatshirt, added another crucial element to the investigation. The responsibility of solving this case fell to Detective Ronan Greaves, a veteran police officer known for his meticulousness and ability to unravel the most complex cases. With over 20 years of experience, Greaves was a thoughtful and methodical man, whose calmness contrasted with the intensity of the crimes he investigated. From the moment he arrived at the murder scene, it was clear that this case would be different. As he inspected the scene, his eye lingered on details others might miss. The position of the body, the trajectory of the shots, the location of the objects found. Each tiny fragment of information was a piece of the puzzle he had to put together to make sense of the crime. Greaves knew Amber's murder wasn't a random act. The choice of location, the accuracy of the shots, and the lack of any signs of a burglary suggested the killer had a specific purpose. Perhaps Amber had discovered something she wasn't supposed to know, or perhaps her presence in Pinecrest Ridge had simply led her to cross the wrong path. Whatever the reason, the detective was determined to find answers, not only for justice for Amber, but also to protect the community from any lurking threats. The emotional impact of the crime quickly spread throughout Pinecrest Ridge. Residents, accustomed to a quiet, safe life, were forced to confront a much bleaker reality. For many, Amber wasn't just an unknown journalist visiting, she was a voice seeking the truth, a professional dedicated to exposing stories that would otherwise remain hidden. Her death left a void that could hardly be filled, a reminder of the risks some are willing to take in the name of transparency and justice. As the forensic team worked furiously to compile every shred of evidence, Detective Greaves prepared to dive into an investigation that promised to be long and complicated. He knew the answers wouldn't come easily, but he also knew that every small step would bring him closer to the truth. Deep down, as he looked at Amber's lifeless body and the objects that had once been tools of his trade, Greaves felt a renewed determination. This case wouldn't be just another file on his desk. It would be a personal mission to honor the memory of a woman who had dedicated her life to seeking the truth, even when that pursuit led her to confront the darkest shadows. Amber Lynn Sutherland was born in a small town in California, the only child of Ruth and Harold Sutherland, who always encouraged her to seek the truth and defend her ideals. 5 years before her tragic murder, Amber lost her parents in a devastating car accident. This event profoundly marked her life, forging in her an unwavering determination to expose injustices and give a voice to those without one. Although she never married or had children, Amber dedicated her life to her career as an investigative journalist, a profession she embraced with passion and rigor. Known for her incisive and direct style, her reporting was notable for unraveling the intricacies of political corruption in California. Her courage earned her numerous awards, but also made her a target for those whose secrets preferred to remain hidden. In the months leading up to her death, Amber had been immersed in an investigation into financial irregularities linked to Mayor Kenyon Bagshaw's campaign. This work generated significant tensions, attracting threats and powerful enemies. However, her commitment to the truth never wavered, leaving an indelible legacy in journalism. His life, though short, was a testament to courage and dedication. Darius Calloway, a 42-year-old man with an imposing presence worn thin by years of professional stress, was a well-known figure in the Pinecrest Ridge newspaper community. Formerly an editor at the same newspaper where Amber Sutherland had built her reputation, Darius was seen as a competent, if somewhat troubled, professional. However, his career took a drastic turn when he was fired following an internal investigation led by Amber. That investigation, which sought to uncover ethical irregularities within the editorial team, revealed incriminating evidence against Darius, who had been manipulating information to favor certain political interests. From then on, his resentment toward Amber became more than just a work-related grudge. It was a consuming personal obsession. Darius's contempt wasn't limited to the private sphere. He had repeatedly publicly expressed his anger toward Amber, blaming her for ruining his career and, he believed, his reputation. His words were so vehement that even his colleagues began to distance themselves from him, fearful of his emotional volatility. But what really caught Detective Ronan Greaves's attention was a persistent rumor. Darius had been involved in leaking false information about Amber to other media outlets, attempting to discredit her and make her an easy target for those who wished to silence her. This detail added an additional layer of suspicion, as it suggested that Darius might have had motives to orchestrate, directly or indirectly, her ultimate elimination. When Detective Greaves questioned Darius, he maintained a defiant, almost arrogant demeanor, as if he believed his version of events was unassailable. According to his statement, Darius claimed he had been meeting with a group of friends at a nearby bar at the time of the murder. He described the evening as a quiet one, spent sharing memories and forgetting old rivalries. However, when investigators delved deeper into his alibi, troubling inconsistencies emerged. Some of the witnesses who supported his version had criminal records, and upon further questioning showed signs of nervousness and insecurity. It was evident that they could have been pressured or even bribed to corroborate Darius's story, a scenario that did not surprise Greaves, given the suspect's track record. What made Darius particularly suspicious was not only his lack of a solid alibi, but also his behavior in the weeks leading up to the crime. He had been seen hanging around the Pinecrest Community Center on multiple occasions, claiming to be interested in covering local events as a freelancer. While this explanation might seem plausible, phone records revealed suspicious calls between Darius and people linked to illicit activities. Furthermore, emails were found in which he expressed his desire to take Amber down once and for all, ambiguous phrases that could be interpreted in multiple ways, but which together traced an alarming pattern. Detective Greaves knew that Darius's resentment toward Amber wasn't enough to prove his guilt, but each piece of the puzzle brought him closer to a possible connection. Darius's life, marked by professional and personal failures, seemed to have transformed into an obsessive quest for revenge. His hatred toward Amber was not only personal but also symbolic. She represented everything he had lost and everything he would never be again. As he reviewed the evidence and reconstructed Darius's movements in the hours leading up to the crime, Greaves couldn't help but wonder if the man had crossed the line between spite and violence. Although there was still no conclusive evidence placing Darius at the crime scene, his profile as a suspect was too significant to be ignored. Every piece of information, every conflicting testimony, and every digital trail fueled the hypothesis that Darius Calloway could have played a central role in Amber Sutherland's murder. For Greaves, solving this case involved not only finding the culprit, but also understanding how such a deep resentment could drive someone to commit such an extreme act. And as he analyzed the details, the detective knew there were still many questions to be answered before the truth could fully emerge. Evelyn Morrissey, 51, was a woman whose life revolved around control and manipulation. Known for her calculating nature, she had built a successful career as a campaign consultant, always working from the shadows to shape realities in favor of her clients. Her ability to anticipate problems and devise strategies made her an invaluable asset to any politician seeking to consolidate their power. However, this same ability also made her dangerous, as Evelyn did not hesitate to cross ethical lines when necessary. Over the years, she had faced numerous conflicts with journalists who questioned the integrity of the campaigns she led. For her, these reporters were nothing more than obstacles that had to be neutralized, whether through legal tactics or, in some cases, resorting to more obscure methods. In the months leading up to Amber Sutherland's murder, Evelyn found herself immersed in Mayor Kenyon Bagshaw's campaign. It was a mission she considered personal. She was protecting not only her client's career, but also her own reputation. Amber, a trenchant investigative journalist known for her tenacity, had begun unraveling a potential case of illegal financing linked to Bagshaw's campaign. This scrutiny posed a direct threat to Evelyn, who feared the journalist would uncover compelling evidence that could not only bring down the mayor, but also ruin her own career path. The pressure on Evelyn grew daily, and her strategic mind began searching for desperate solutions to remove this obstacle. When Detective Ronan Greaves questioned her about her whereabouts on the night of the crime, Evelyn responded calmly, claiming she had been at a private dinner with members of the campaign team. She described the event in careful detail, even mentioning trivial anecdotes to support her alibi. However, further investigation revealed a crucial discrepancy. The restaurant receipts showed that the bill had been paid before the murder took place. This discovery left an unaccounted-for time gap, a gap Evelyn could not convincingly explain. It was then that suspicion began to fall on her more strongly. Tobias Harlow, 38, was a man whose life seemed marked by obsession and control. His relationship with Amber Sutherland had been intense from the beginning, but not in a good way. Tobias had a long history of possessive behavior, exerting emotional dominance that gradually escalated into more aggressive behavior. During their years together as a couple, Amber suffered the consequences of his volatile nature. He was arrested twice for domestic violence. However, thanks to out-of-court settlements, he never spent more than a few hours in custody. These incidents left deep scars on Amber, who eventually decided to end the relationship. To protect herself, she obtained a restraining order against him, but that only fueled his anger further. Despite the legally imposed distance, Tobias was unable to get over the breakup. He clung to the idea that Amber belonged to him, even after she tried to rebuild her life away from him. He repeatedly threatened her, making it clear that no one else could have her if he couldn't. His words were a mix of desperation and hatred, reflecting a deeply unstable mind. Although Amber tried to stay away, she always felt Tobias's shadow following her, a constant reminder of the danger he posed. This unhealthy obsession quickly made him a key suspect in her murder, as his history of domestic violence and previous threats pointed to him as someone capable of extreme acts. When Detective Ronan Greaves questioned him about his whereabouts on the night of the crime, Tobias responded with apparent calm, claiming he had been at home watching television. He described his routine in precise detail, as if trying to prove his innocence with every word. However, his cell phone records revealed something very different. Several calls made from a tower near the murder site contradicted his alibi, leaving a trail that directly connected him to the crime scene. This discovery cast significant doubt on his version of events, placing him in a much more suspicious light. Tobias's obsession with Amber not only made him dangerous but also unpredictable. His inability to accept that she was no longer a part of his life consumed him completely. It was clear that his love for Amber had transformed into something much darker, a mixture of jealousy, rage, and resentment that drove him to act impulsively and irrationally. Although he had no direct connection to the political issues surrounding Amber in her final days, his violent history and lack of a solid alibi made him a plausible candidate for murder. However, as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Tobias was neither the only suspect nor the primary perpetrator. Physical clues and forensic evidence began to point to other parties involved, leaving Tobias in an ambiguous position. Still, his presence in the story served as a disturbing reminder of the lasting impact a toxic relationship can have. Tobias was a man trapped in his own labyrinth of obsession, where the line between love and control had been completely blurred. His life, marked by anger and possessiveness, illustrated how the past can haunt us and how destructive emotions can lead to irreparable acts. After weeks of exhaustive and meticulous investigation, Detective Ronan Greaves unraveled the truth behind Amber Sutherland's brutal murder. It was a case filled with complexities, hidden secrets, and characters whose motivations ranged from power, fear, and revenge. However, it was Evelyn Morrissey, Mayor Kenyon Bagshaw's campaign advisor, who finally confessed to being the mastermind behind the crime. The decisive moment came during an intense interrogation in which Greaves confronted Evelyn with irrefutable evidence. Although she initially tried to maintain her innocence, the pressure of the mounting evidence led her to admit her involvement in the plot to eliminate Amber. In a voice that was cold but laced with self-serving justifications, Evelyn declared that she could not allow Amber to jeopardize the mayor's campaign. According to her, Amber's investigative journalism had gone too far, exposing financial irregularities that could have destroyed not only Bagshaw, but also everything Evelyn had built in her political career. For Evelyn, hiring a hitman was a pragmatic, if extremely cruel, solution to protect her interests and those of her client. The key details that led to the resolution of the case were revelatory and demonstrated how even the smallest clues can unmask a culprit. One of the key discoveries was the matching of the black fibers found at the crime scene to a jacket belonging to Evelyn. This finding was crucial, as it established a physical connection between Evelyn and the location where the murder occurred. The fibers, analyzed under forensic microscopy, exhibited unique characteristics that perfectly matched the fabric of Evelyn's garment. Another vital clue was phone records, showing suspicious calls between Evelyn and a known local offender, identified as Marcus Hargrove. a man with a history of violence and criminal activity. These calls occurred in the days leading up to the murder and coincided with Marcus's suspicious movements near Pinecrest Ridge. Furthermore, a key witness claimed to have seen Evelyn having a heated argument with Amber shortly before the crime. Although the witness's testimony initially seemed circumstantial, it gained significance when combined with other evidence pointing to Evelyn as the instigator of the murder. Finally, definitive confirmation came when the weapon used in the crime, a .38 caliber revolver, was recovered from a nearby river. Ballistics analysis determined that the bullets extracted from Amber's body matched those fired from that weapon. The silencer used by the hitman, designed to avoid detection, was also found at the same location, wrapped in a dark cloth containing fiber remnants similar to Evelyn's jacket. This discovery sealed Evelyn's fate, proving that she had been involved down to the last detail in the planning and execution of the crime. Evelyn's hired assassin, Marcus Hargrove, operated with surgical precision. Wearing gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, Marcus had managed to cover almost all of his tracks. However, he made one fatal error. He forgot to completely clean the hood of Amber's vehicle, leaving partial prints before putting on the gloves that eventually led investigators to Evelyn. The calls were enough to establish a solid connection between the hitman and the campaign advisor. The motivation behind the crime was as clear as it was devastating. Evelyn feared that Amber's investigation into Kenyon Bagshaw's campaign finances would expose an illegal financing scheme involving covert donations from questionable sources. Amber had been on the verge of publishing an explosive article that included damning documents, something Evelyn knew could ruin both the mayor and her own professional reputation. In her mind, eliminating Amber was a necessary measure to protect her ambitions and ensure Bagshaw's political success. Evelyn's confession not only confirmed her guilt, but also exposed the deep ethical fissures that existed within the mayor's campaign team. Although Kenyon Bagshaw was not directly charged with the murder, his name was tainted by association. Evelyn's involvement in the crime was a fatal blow to her political career, and shortly after her aide's arrest, Bagshaw publicly announced her retirement from politics. Her image, carefully constructed over years, crumbled in the public eye, leaving a legacy marked by scandal and betrayal. For Detective Constable Ronan Greaves, solving this case was a deeply personal experience. He had worked tirelessly to honor Amber's memory, a journalist who had dedicated her life to seeking the truth. As he closed the case, Greaves reflected on how the lust for power and control can drive people to commit heinous acts. Amber's murder was not only a crime against a brave and committed woman, but also a grim reminder of the risks faced by those who challenge the powerful. The trial for Amber Sutherland's murder was a pivotal moment for the Pinecrest Ridge community and journalism in general. Evelyn Morrissey, accused of conspiracy to commit murder, faced multiple charges following her confession. During the trial, chilling details were revealed about how she had hired a hitman to eliminate Amber, demonstrating the lengths she was willing to go to protect her career and Mayor Kenyon Bagshaw's campaign. The final verdict handed down a severe sentence for Evelyn, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case left deep scars on Pinecrest Ridge, but also exposed uncomfortable truths about corruption and power. Although Kenyon Bagshaw was never formally charged, his reputation was shattered, and he announced his retirement from politics shortly afterward. Beyond the legal consequences, Amber's legacy resonated as a call to action. Her death served as a grim reminder of the risks faced by those who challenge the powerful with the truth. Inspired by her courage, other journalists continued her investigative work, determined not to allow her sacrifice to be in vain. The community honored her memory by establishing a foundation in her name, dedicated to protecting threatened reporters and promoting transparency in political circles. Thus, Amber's impact transcended her own tragedy, becoming a beacon of justice and perseverance.